If you asked most people what early Christians believed, they'd say something about heaven, the afterlife, maybe the cross. But the earliest Christian document we have, Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, says almost nothing about any of that. Instead, it reads more like a recruitment letter for an apocalyptic rescue operation. So what did Paul preach? Let's look at the text. 1 Thessalonians 1:9-10 contains 4 demands. First, turn from idols. Paul told polytheistic Gentiles that Zeus, Apollo, and Artemis were dead gods of stone and wood. Only the God of Israel was real. This was the most radical demand he could make. Civic life in a Greco-Roman city revolved around temple worship. Rejecting the gods meant social, economic, and political suicide. Second, serve the living God, not just belief, monotheistic allegiance. Third, wait for his Son from heaven. Jesus would descend imminently. Paul expected this within his own lifetime. This was not a metaphor. Fourth, be rescued from the coming wrath. The payoff was not heaven, not eternal life. It was escape from divine destruction about to fall on the world. Notice what's missing. No mention of heaven as a destination, no afterlife, no cross as atonement, no resurrection of believers. This is an apocalyptic rescue framework, pure and simple. To understand what Paul's converts were signing up for, we need to understand the world they lived in. Roman society ran on the household. At the top sat the paterfamilias, the male head with legal authority over every member. Below him, sons and daughters. Below them, freed persons and clients bound by obligation. At the bottom, slaves. This wasn't just a family structure. It was the basic unit of Roman social, economic, and political life. Honor and loyalty flowed upward. Protection and resources flowed down. Everyone knew their place. Paul's house churches mapped directly onto this structure. When Paul writes to the church that meets in someone's house, the householder is the patron. Their family members, clients, freed persons, and slaves form the congregation. The social hierarchy of the household is the organizational chart of the church. This matters because many people assume early Christian communities were countercultural, egalitarian gatherings that broke with Roman social norms. They weren't. Paul greeted named householders because those were the patrons who provided the space, the resources, and the social authority. The church replicated the household. It didn't replace it. Inside this household world, Paul's most controversial demand makes sense. In 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul turns to sexual ethics. He uses the Greek term porneia, usually translated in English Bibles as sexual immorality. That vague phrase lets modern readers project their own assumptions onto the text. But for a first century Jew, porneia meant something vast and specific. Here's what porneia covered. Adultery, sex with anyone other than one's spouse, masturbation, homosexual acts, specific sexual positions. For example, a woman on top was considered porneia. Penetration of a man by a woman using an implement, or oral sex, whether homosexual or heterosexual. Right? This was not a narrow moral category. It was a sweeping Jewish boundary marker, a catch-all for everything Gentiles do sexually that we don't. When English Bibles compress all of this into the phrase sexual immorality, they obscure the original meaning entirely. Right? A modern reader sees that phrase and thinks adultery, maybe premarital sex. A first century Jew heard porneia and thought of a vast catalog of Gentile behavior that marked outsiders as unclean. Now look at 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 4. Paul tells each man to know how to control his own skills. Right? A Greek word meaning vessel or sink. Scholars have debated this for centuries. 3 main interpretations exist. Right? First, skills means his own body. Paul is telling men to master their physical impulses. Second, skills means his wife. The woman is the vessel the man must manage in holiness. Third, skills means his genitalia, a euphemism for male sexual organs. Each interpretation has strong scholarly support. But here's what matters. All three readings frame the issue identically. This is about male self-management of sexuality. The man is the agent. The man is the one addressed. The man is the one who controls. Notice who this passage concerns and who it doesn't. In verse 6, Paul warns against defrauding a brother in this matter. The concern is not harm to the woman, it's theft from the man who owns her sexuality. A wife's body belongs to her husband. To sleep with another man's wife is to rob him of his property. And the text shows zero concern for the woman's experience, consent, or interests. This isn't a gotcha. It's a historical observation. This framework was standard across Jewish and Greco-Roman moral thought. Paul is not unusual here, but understanding this context prevents us from reading modern ideas of mutual consent back into the text. So what does all this add up to? Three conclusions reshape how we read the earliest Christianity we can access. First, Paul's message was apocalyptic rescue, not spiritual self-improvement or afterlife insurance. Jesus was coming back within Paul's lifetime to save his followers from divine wrath. When we read later Christian theology back into 1 Thessalonians, we miss what made this movement distinctive and urgent. Second, Paul's sexual ethics were not abstract moral principles. They were a specific Jewish boundary marker separating insiders from outsiders. Porneia drew a line around Gentile sexual behavior and declared all of it unclean. And these ethics were built on a patriarchal property framework, one that becomes invisible the moment we translate porneia as sexual immorality in English. Third, Paul's churches were not egalitarian spiritual communities. They were patron-client networks embedded in Roman household hierarchies. The householder sat at the top. Everyone else arranged themselves below according to their social rank. The earliest Christianity we can read doesn't look much like any church you've ever been to. Paul's converts weren't promised heaven. They were promised rescue. They weren't asked to improve themselves morally. They were told to abandon their gods and wait for a cosmic intervention that never came, or at least not on Paul's timeline. That's not a problem for historical study. It's the starting point for understanding what happened next.